You're new to hi-fi. Maybe you've watched a couple of my videos or videos of other audio nerds and you heard them say a whole bunch of words and you thought to yourself, what the hell is he talking about? Well, let me put on my audiophile hat and see if we can help you a little bit with that in this introduction to hi-fi terminology. Now, the laundry list of hi-fi terminology is kind of encyclopedic. There's a lot, and it's kind of ridiculous. We're not going to cover everything here, but we are going to look at some of the more commonly used terms, or at least some of the most important to understand terms. First one we're going to talk about is open back versus close back. This mainly refers to just headphones, but it's still a concept that's really important to understand. The difference between an open back headphone and a closed back headphone is in the name. A headphone that is open means that it is of an open design. A headphone that is closed means that it is of a closed design. An open back headphone is a headphone that has little to no material blocking the back end of the driver. This allows sound to kind of naturally breathe out of the headphone, and it in general provides a more natural sound while also giving you more soundstage. A closed back headphone is the opposite. You have physical material that is blocking the sound from leaving the headphone. It is isolating the sound to just your ears. This means that you are not really able to hear the environment around you, and if there are other people in the room with you, they can't hear what you're listening to. The benefit from this is you are getting a more intimate listening experience most of the time. And also in general, you will get a bit of a punchier bass line from this. But because you're not really allowing the sound to naturally breathe, you may also encounter some resonance. There are benefits from one to the other, and there are also detractors. It's really a preference thing more than anything else. But in general, the general consensus is a lot of higher end headphones are often open because it does allow for a much more natural sound. It allows for stuff to breathe and it allows for soundstage. Whereas closed back headphones are maybe more suitable for monitoring, where you really need to have a very intimate listening experience with your audio for referencing and monitoring. Low end, mid-range, high end. These are terms referring to the different zones in a frequency range. Your low end refers to your bass range, your mid-range refers to your mid-range, and your high end refers to your treble range. On the frequency graph, if we look at it here, if we break this down, the bass range is going to be between 60 and 250 hertz in general. Next above that will be your low mids. These are the kind of lowest frequencies that are still more or less in the mid-range, kind of like your mid-bass. That happens in the 250 to 500 hertz range. Next up would be the mid-range. This is where the majority of your sound is coming from. That is between 500 and 2000 hertz. A step above that is, of course, your high mids. So when your mid-range starts to blend into your treble range, we're looking at 2000 to 6000 hertz in general. And then things above 6000 hertz are where you're hitting into your treble range. Now, this graph is only showing a very specific range of frequencies. Yes, frequencies can go further down the road and further up the road, but we're kind of limiting this to the limitation of human hearing. It is nearly impossible for a human being to hear anything over 20,000 hertz. Your low end, your mid-range, your high end just refers to the zones of this frequency range, and it is from this frequency range that we are receiving our sound. Now let's talk about soundstage and imaging. These two terms are very often mistaken or misunderstood between each other. Soundstage is the sensation of having space between you and what you are listening to. Something that has very, very narrow soundstage is something that sounds like it's beaming the sound directly into your ears. If you think of like maybe IEMs or earbuds, something that goes into your ears or placed right on your ears, that is closed back, more likely than not, it's going to have a very narrow soundstage, and it's going to sound like it's just kind of left, right here, beaming directly into your ears. You get something that has soundstage, like for example, an open back headphone, all of a sudden, rather than the sound sounding like it is projecting directly into your ears, it sounds like it's out away from you. You have this sensation of space. And that's all it is. It's a sensation of space. The wider the soundstage, the wider that sensation of space can be. You can go from a soundstage that is fairly narrow to kind of a middle of the road to something that feels gargantuan. If something feels really, really huge, it's likely because of soundstage. Imaging, on the other hand, does not refer to the space or enormity of what you're listening to. Imaging refers to exactly how you are able to identify where sound is coming from. Very good imaging is going to be probably all around you. You could really get this sensation of being able to identify sound in front of you, above you, to your side, and even behind you. But imaging can come in many flavors. You can get a very forward-facing imaging where you don't really hear or get the sensation of things behind you, but you have a pretty good idea of what's in front of you. You can, in a very maybe horizontal way, identify where things are in front of you. Or you can maybe have imaging that gives you a little bit of verticality, so you can get some separation of where things are coming from in front of you, but also maybe a little bit above you. The ideal imaging is going to be a 360 degrees of it, where you can hear when things are coming from behind you, from your right, from your left, from up top, from maybe a little bit below. It just means that you are able to precisely identify where sound is coming from. That's the distinction. Sound stage is how big the sound sounds. Imaging is being able to identify where the sound is coming from. Resolution. It is kind of what it sounds like. If you think of a video resolution, right? A video that has low resolution is very pixelated, details get lost, it's just kind of messy looking and not very clear. You get a video that has a higher resolution, you're able to see more, there's less pixelation, there's more detail. It's the same with audio. When you have something that is a high resolution audio experience, a high resolution listening experience, it means that you are hearing a lot of that extra detail and you are receiving a lot more information than you would from something that has very low resolution. Certain drivers are able to perform better than other drivers, or certain drivers may be tuned differently from the same driver to allow for that driver to perform in a different way. And oftentimes that may or may not result in better resolution. You can have identical drivers in different headphones that will sound different depending on how they're built, depending on how they're tuned, depending on how they're designed in the headphone structure. All these things can, even though it's technically the same driver and the same technology, they can result in not only different characteristics of the sound, but also result in better performance from the driver, giving you more resolution. Detail is exactly what it sounds like. The detail you were able to retrieve from your sound is how much information you're able to really get from it. The details, the nuances, how much of that little minute little sounds are you able to hear and pick up and be able to identify. Something that has very good detail means that you are able to listen to, hear, and identify even the smallest minutia of sound. Whereas something that has very bad detail sounds rather muddy and it's very difficult to distinct anything beyond maybe a very general range of sound. Dynamics. This is one I use a lot, and I want to make sure it's very clear what it means. Dynamics is the rate and range of change between the softest and loudest part of your sound. It is the sudden change between something being quiet and something being loud, and how much of a difference that is. Something that has poor dynamics means that things that are soft and things that are loud sound fairly the same. There's not a whole lot of difference between them, versus something that has very good dynamics would have a very obvious change between your softest sound and your loudest sound. Extension only refers to your bass range and your treble range. When something has more extension, it just means that it is able to reach further into that frequency range in that direction. So when I say something has, for example, really good bass extension, it doesn't mean necessarily that the bass is harder hitting. It just means that you are able to receive more information further down that bass frequency range, down to like your sub-bass region. It means that you are getting more frequency, not necessarily louder bass. And the same with treble. Something has very good treble extension or high-end extension. It means that you are hearing higher frequencies. You're getting more information, not necessarily that it's louder. That's the distinction here. You're getting a wider frequency range, an extended frequency range, not necessarily louder treble or louder bass. Neutral or neutrality. Neutrality refers to a flat, even sound signature, where no part of the frequency is necessarily being emphasized. Your treble range, your bass range, and your mid range are all performing at pretty much the same level. There's nothing really being flavored here. You are getting the most intended sound from its original recording. Anything beyond neutral, you're getting a little bit of extra stuff. So if something is very, very neutral, it means that it is the most flat, the most even, and the most closest to an original sound source. Distortion. Now, in the most general terms, any change from the original audio source is considered distortion. If your output of audio sounds in any way different from the input of audio, that is going to be considered distortion. Now, distortion isn't always a negative. A lot of the times, something like a headphone can add flavor to a sound, right? It adds a characteristic to it. The headphone's characteristic, its flavor, its sound signature, to make it sound more like, say, a Sennheiser headphone has a Sennheiser sound signature. So it makes your music sound more Sennheiser-y. That is still technically distortion because it is going to be different from the original audio source. It's very, very difficult, sometimes almost impossible, to not have distortion in your audio chain. But again, it's not necessarily a negative. Where it does become a negative is when distortion is kind of hitting extremes and you're getting very noticeable noise and buzzing and a lack of resolution from your audio source. That's distortion you really don't want to have. Warm, cold, dark, bright, and mid-forward. These are very, very popular audiophile terms that are in general there to describe certain kind of general characteristics of your headphone or your speaker. But let's break it down a little bit. Warm specifically refers to your bass range, and something that is warm has a bit more elevation in the bass. The bass is a bit more emphasized than something very neutral. So in general, you're going to have a bit more punch in the bass, and it's going to be, in general, a much more smooth listening experience. Cold is the opposite. It is a recession of bass, a reduction in bass. So it is less punchy and more probably focused on your mid and treble range. You're getting more of that information than you are your low end. So rather than it sounding very punchy and smooth, now it's starting to sound very analytical. It's very crisp. Dark refers to recessed treble. The treble has been crunched down and rolled off quicker than normal. So you're not hitting high notes as much. You're not getting a lot of that detail, but you're also pulling away from maybe some of the more fatiguing frequencies. So you might be a bit more of an easier listening experience, but maybe less of a detailed one. Bright is the opposite of dark. It is an emphasis in the treble range. You are getting now more treble information, more detail in that high end, with the trade-off of maybe hitting some of those more fatiguing and irritating frequencies. And also potentially even getting into stuff like sibilance. Mid-forward just means that the overall sound is projecting more of your mid-range than you are your bass range or your treble range. You're getting more of your in-between than you are your ends. Timbre. Yes, it is pronounced timbre. This one's very complex. It's a very nuanced term, but it's important to understand. In general, it is the tonal character of the sound. It is the quality of the musical sound or voice distinct from its pitch or intensity. In other words, it is what makes a particular musical instrument or voice sound different from another. A perfect example is you have a large range of wood instruments, right? And all these different wood instruments sound different, but they are wood instruments. So they have a tonality for wood instruments, but they all sound different. So they all have their own timbre. Likewise, vocalists, we're all humans singing with our vocal cords, but we all sound different. We all have our own timbre. Power refers to how much voltage a headphone or other device is required in order to perform as it is intended to. Your impedance and sensitivity are a good metric of identifying how much power your device might need. Most higher end hi-fi, headphones, speakers, whatever, they're not really able to perform at the level they are intended to perform at if they're not being given an adequate amount of power from an independent source. An example of this is powering your really big planar magnetic headphones from your PC headphone input jack versus an actual headphone amplifier. Some headphones just need that extra power in order to really produce the sound as intended. And finally, channel imbalance. We just talked about this recently, but channel imbalance, when you have something, for example, that is stereo, like headphones, you have a speaker on your left, you have a speaker on your right. The most ideal situation is that those speakers, those drivers, are performing identically. They have the same performance level and they are performing at the same volume. When they are not performing identically, that becomes a channel imbalance. You're getting more information from one driver than you are the other. That's a channel imbalance. You always want to aim for balance in your drivers. And there we have it. There's your little introduction to strange, wacky, and wild hi-fi terminology. It's weird, it's a lot, but hopefully this can kind of be a reference video that you can kind of come back to every once in a while to maybe get a refresher, because it's a lot to remember. I'll probably use this as a refresher for myself, if I'm being perfectly honest with you, because it can be a little difficult to keep all this terminology in track. But again, this isn't everything. The list of terminology is kind of ridiculous and it can get way, way out there. But I think if you have a general understanding of these terms, you're going to have a much better time following what I'm talking about and what a lot of other audio nerds are talking about. So I hope that was interesting for you. I hope that was helpful. If you haven't already, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel a lot. And I'll see you next time.